Good afternoon, Jessica, and thank you very much for giving some time to the Mint to talk to us here in San Diego.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start first by asking you just to set out what is your core interest in terms of research that you focused on in your work?
So my real interest is transformation, economic justice and transformation. So changing economic systems to really provide true well-being to human beings, particularly low wealth, marginalized, subaltern communities that have been left out of general economies, and to apply a solidarity economy, cooperative principles to economic activity in order to create more well-being at the community level.
So the sorts of transformations that interest you are transformations to greater community wealth.
Greater
right?
community wealth, greater democratic economic participation, better distribution of wealth and income.
And when you say community wealth, what does that really mean?
So for me, I'm not so much worried about whether each individual person has, $2 million of stock or whatever. What I'm interested in is whether groups of people as communities, and communities for me are communities of interest and also local proximity. So people who live in the same area and have the same set of interests and are sort of in this world together. And for me, the wealth is that whole community together has enough resources so that nobody's hungry, nobody's homeless, nobody's powerless. And so that's what I mean. So I'm not so much, I do want everyone to have a home, but it could be collectively owned or a shared home. It could be a community land trust that everybody has a right to a home space. So I'm not as much worried about whether people have a wealth portfolio that they individually own, but that they're a part of a community that has enough resources so everybody is doing well.
So you're talking about resources, you mentioned houses and food. Do you also think of wealth in terms of capabilities?
Yes.
So I suppose to have wealth over time.
Right. And to keep developing, I believe it's about continuity and continuous learning. So we're always improving. That's also why I feel this group notion is so important, because we learn better as a group, as working together, sharing ideas. And so for me, the ways that we can improve economic justice and economic prosperity is through learning and working together in ways that will promote better life for everybody. I actually believe that when we, the opposite of what neo-capitalism, that if you do it for yourself, it somehow miraculously helps everybody else. I don't believe that. Right. I believe we have to be doing it together for each other, and that's when it helps everybody. And for me, trying to figure out what are the different kinds of structures, and one of the reasons I like solidarity cooperative economics is because they're about learning by doing, and so you're also doing education, social development, etc., while you're doing economic development, and so you get kind of that whole comprehensive growth or comprehensive well-being.
And so structures, by structures you mean legal structures, or what?
Not necessarily. So legal structures, especially in a place like the United States, help. Actually, sometimes they hurt, but let's go with they help.
Okay.
For the moment.
Yeah.
But I really mean structures of relationships, power and decision-making, and structures of distribution. So for me, that's why I've kind of focused on cooperative ownership, because the international cooperative movement actually has a set of structures, right? People are all supposed to participate freely. They're supposed to be democratic. Nobody's supposed to have a bigger vote or more influence than anybody else. That's what I mean by structures. I sort of add the solidarity principles because I also believe in non-exploitation and sustainability and environmental justice, and so the solidarity principles bring in those other pieces that not all co-ops have. So I try to meld those so that we end up with this system of real reciprocity, respect, participation, justice for both the planet and for human beings, sustainability for the long run, learning by doing, collective learning, and collective distribution kind of thing.
And so how did you start off into this area? what got you going? What were you doing before?
Right. I was raised by social activists. So I was raised to be what we call the servant leader, meaning I should do whatever I do in life should be something that helps the rest of the world. I shouldn't just be trying to promote myself or make myself better or whatever. Yeah. So I always had this notion that whatever I did had to do something to make the world better. And
your parents were social. What sort of social activists?
Well, my mother was a physician, a pediatrician actually, but she believed in child welfare and wellness and prevention. So she was always very frustrated with her profession. She was also a civil rights activist, a feminist.
And this was where and when? So.
In New York, from the 50s on. My father, a psychologist, an educational psychologist, so he did a lot of work in education reform and progressive education and child development. And he also, they were both social activists in the sense of, civil rights, anti-war, anti-nuclear, women's rights. So we were always sort of talking about those things. We were,
but not economists.
No, they weren't. Though actually, my mother's first degree was in political economy.
Okay.
She was pre-med. No, well, she was pre-med, but she believed in being well-rounded. So she got her degree in political economy with all the pre-med courses, and then went to medical school.
So why did you choose economics though?
So then I chose.
You could have gone medicine.
Right. Well, I didn't want to go medicine. I wasn't that interested in psychology. I started out in literature. That was actually my passion, literature and poetry. But I decided that I couldn't do real change. I didn't think I could do enough change through that. Then I tried education. I have a master's in elementary education, but I decided I was a horrible elementary school teacher. Though the education ended up helping me now because I believe so much in the importance of education toward cooperative economics.
Yeah.
But then I decided that really most of the things I felt like I should change was the economic status of subaltern people, but I didn't have the tools from literature and education, which I had already excelled in. I realized that in the West, the economics profession had, had a stranglehold on us in terms of limiting the options for really changing the world, for making change. That neoclassical economics, capitalism, was really stopping us from doing what we needed to do economically. So I decided
How was it stopping us?
Well, because it was confining economics to just pure individualistic, get what you can and to hell with everybody else, and that if you get what you can and do something good for yourself, you made it and you were successful. And
did you know this before you studied economics, or was this
yes.
a shock when you came into it?
No,
you knew that was what you were up against.
My parents talked about these things, even though they weren't economists.
Yeah, they knew that
they talked about these things. They didn't always have all the words for it, and they didn't, but they were sort of historical materialists, so they weren't afraid to talk about Marxist issues, so we knew what Marxism was growing up.
Yeah.
So, we... and as I was working my way through sort of education, I also became a child advocate and did some child advocacy research. I realized, that was the economics, current economic systems that were stopping us from putting in the kind of policies that would make life better for children, that would stop homelessness, that kind of thing. Yeah. I decided I should learn economics so I could figure out how to turn it on its head.
And could you find somewhere? I mean, where did you go and study?
I went to UMass Amherst.
Of course you did. So
I only applied.
You knew where to go.
I only applied there. It was the only school. I actually looked up several places. But in the days that I went to UMass in the 80s, they actually had a strong program where you had to learn neoclassical economics, and then you had to learn 3 different Marxist or political economy structures.
Right.
So I figured that I was going to get the best, broadest training I could.
So you were incredibly lucky, weren't you, in terms of the fact the knowledge you had? Because most people going into economics
don't know,
have no idea,
and don't know what they want to do with it or how to think about it. No, I knew what I wanted to do with it. I knew what I was fighting against, and I just needed the tools. I also had always been really good in math, and I knew that economics had become a very math-based program. But luckily, I felt I could handle it. And so what I wanted to do was master the master's tools, right? And then find out, learn as much as I could about the alternative ways and how to undermine or attack the existing structures to find better structures.
And do you think, I mean, the idea of cooperatives has been, presumably at the time you started, was quite niche, and do you think it's changed? Do you think it's become more mainstream as...
It has. I mean, the other thing that's really interesting, even at UMass Amherst, at the time I was there, we didn't study cooperatives or even cooperative economics. We studied Marxism, we studied institutional economics, we studied political economy in general. There were actually two different Marxism. There was traditional Marxism and what was the other one called? Postmodern, post-Marxist something.
So institutional economics didn't actually cover co-ops?
Not the one that I took. I mean, I think we knew a little bit about like Yugoslavian co-ops. You might have had like one section on that, but we didn't really study co-ops. So when I came out, I didn't actually know about co-ops when I came out with my PhD degree. I actually specialized in those days in financial regulation, international finance, financial regulations, capital controls. And newly industrializing countries. So I was looking at how newly industrialized countries used capital controls and financial regulations to industrialize and modernize or whatever. That was my original specialty in macroeconomics.
Yeah, and that is where a lot of heterodox economists sort of place themselves, isn't it? And partly I sort of feel because those are the big things, aren't they?
Turns out knowing that stuff, has really helped me. I changed from being a macroeconomist to a micro when I did community development. But knowing that field and understanding like the difference between export substitution and import all that kind of stuff really helped a lot to understand local development, which is then I trained myself in cooperatives, community economic development and cooperatives. Now UMass actually has a certificate in cooperatives, but that was 10 years or 15 years after I left that they did that.
And did people find it a bit odd? Because, I mean, quite often when you start talking about these micro things, they say, well, that's all very nice, but...
Oh, and very unrealistic, They all
you'll never go far,
So then that was my problem. People were saying unrealistic, that's not the way to go, why are you being, pie in the sky, that kind of thing. So then I had to say, okay, let me figure out where these processes, these kinds of systems have worked or existed. I was mostly focused on African American community development. Is that where you came across? Because
you're in this finance, capital controls, all this sort of stuff. How did you come across the cooperative idea?
Well, I've had a very eclectic career. So after getting my PhD, nobody hiring me in international finance, I went back to work for the Children's Defense Fund, where I'd worked after I got my master's in education and realized I wasn't a good teacher. I went and did that child advocacy stuff. Well, the Children's Defense Fund was starting a new program for the Black Community Crusade for Children, which was to get Black communities to focus on pro-children policies that they should be promoting nationally and locally to make their communities stronger. And I was hired as their community development specialist.
Not as an economist at all?
Well, community economic development. Right, economic development specialist.
You rewrote your CV.
And they created a job for me because I had worked for them before, so they knew me. So in that job, I was supposed to be matching Black community family values and community economic development, and what kinds of programs, strategies should we be helping Black communities to strive for that would also promote that well-being or whatever. And that's where I came across co-ops, or came across co-ops, and started thinking of co-ops as a community development strategy. And so that's where I started. Because
there were co-ops already in place that in the community?
There were some co-ops in the community, but also I went back, I talked to a friend of mine who had done a thesis on W.E.B. Du Bois's economic theories, and he had these group economy co-op theories. So he told me what to read from W.E.B. Du Bois. I had another colleague at the Children's Defense Fund who was talking to the Cooperative Business Development Association because she had heard them give some kind of presentation about community development, and so she was like, oh, go look at this. I was going to conferences and taking some certificates on community development, and they were talking about community-initiated, community-based development, and co-ops was one of the menu of things there. So I was slowly, in all the different areas that I was looking for information about community-controlled economics, I was slowly finding these little things. But as I talked to black communities, they still weren't resonating. The term didn't mean anything to them, and they were telling me, oh, black people don't do co-ops. And so I was like, that's not possible. So I'm a researcher.
What was it about the word? I mean, I suppose the tradition comes from England, Manchester, doesn't it?
Yes,
the
and then
co-ops, but
in the groups I was talking to, the word actually, they connected it to hippie communes and hippie food co-ops. And so so it was really weird because it made no sense to me either. But then I took it upon myself. I was like, okay, I'm going to prove that co-ops are part of the black tradition. Right? So
that's where you wanted to look at the history.
Right. So that's why I decided to go back to the U.S. history. I tried to do a little bit of African history, but that was much more convoluted. But I had a few things that showed that Africans had practiced cooperativism from very early on. Native Americans even had a little stuff.
Early
African civilizations. No.
Oh, this is going way
back.
Way
back. The early African civilizations used cooperativism,
right,
and collectivism. This is 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, kind of thing. Right. So I learned a little bit about that. Read a few things about people who talked about African Americans having those retentions as they came to the New World, and when they had a chance to, they practiced different varieties of cooperativism and mutualism. So I started learning about that. And then I started looking for examples everywhere I went. I would ask people. I luckily had colleagues at the time who were African American historians, so they would, if they came across something, like I had one woman who was studying Nannie Helen Burroughs, and she came up to me one day and she said, oh, I was just in Nannie Helen Burroughs' archives and she started a co-op in 1930. She was like, you need to go and look at that. So everybody just kept, as soon as they heard I was working on this, I found people who were telling me, oh, look at this, oh, I just read about this, oh, look at this archive, and it's what they call the snowball effect, right?
And having documented all that, did that help? Did the people
it helped a lot.
It did. So then they said, this is us.
Right, yes. And actually, people started telling me, oh, yes, my aunt and uncle were in this co-op, and my grandparents started this co-op, and suddenly the word co-op wasn't in the way anymore. When they stopped thinking of it as some white hippie thing, they suddenly could see what was happening in their own families, in their own communities. And so I had people coming up to me telling me about something their parents or their grandparents or their aunt and uncle were involved in. I had people sending me clippings about their relatives' involvement and stuff. And so suddenly it became, everybody started owning it, which is what I wanted.
And has there, since you started, been a growth in the co-ops and
there's been a growth in a couple of ways. One of the biggest things was just people realizing they were already practicing it in some ways. So that the mutual aid, that's the other thing that I actually learned from W.E.B. Du Bois, who talked about the mutual aid societies, which are actually precursors to the cooperatives, to formal cooperatives. Mm-hmm. It turns out that a lot of families still sort of have these informal mutual aid. I found out people had families where they all put in money to help their members go to college and stuff. And other families who use the Isusu method, and that's how their grandparents paid for their down payment of their house or bought a refrigerator or something. So people would connect all those kinds of things. So that's why I also started connecting solidarity economics and cooperative economics, because some of it isn't officially legally a co-op, but it's a solidarity collective or a cooperative type thing. And so the more you talk about that, more and more people resonate to that also. And so that's where you get this huge, long legacy and history that people actually can see. So one of my first efforts, once I started to understand this history, was to make sure people could see what they were already doing in their everyday lives, and then see how they could do it more formally or more connected.
Because essentially, really, humans have been collaborative people.
Right, right.
So how does this relate to the sort of American situation, the American dream, and the entrepreneur as king? And this, I mean, is there a reinterpretation of the American dream here? Because presumably the struggle and collaboration and so forth, or is this in conflict with? Or?
So in some ways it's in conflict, in some ways the dream is being reformulated. And that actually, I didn't finish answering your other question about the growth. No, but
yeah.
So I can answer them both with this answer. What I noticed was, so the first thing was people connecting to the legacy and seeing what they already do and that they could do more. And some people being interested in doing more, especially when they've tried everything else. So a lot of times the communities that had already been trying to make changes but couldn't get any headway were willing to kind of step back and say, okay, let's be more insular, work within ourselves, stop trying to force the government to do this or the municipality to do this, but let's do it ourselves. That was the first sort of movement I started to see, is instead of
sort of self-help.
Right, this going back to the self-help notion, and what can we do ourselves, and then what do we need the government to do to support what we're doing for ourselves.
Right.
But then with the Great Recession, so what is that, 2007, 2008, 2009, and the Occupy movement, the whole solidarity economy, collectivism started to have more flesh on it for people.
Yeah.
And so I've definitely noticed since 2008, 2009, a lot of people either gave up on the existing system being able to do anything for them, or felt the strength in doing solidarity cooperative stuff and was more receptive to it. So we've had a lot of growth in the U.S., especially
and this is
in the
outside
worker
the
co-op.
black community as well.
Yeah,
yeah.
In the worker co-op movement in general, among young people, also a growth in credit unions, right? Which credit unions were always strong, but people didn't realize there were co-ops in the U.S.
Yeah, right.
Right, but after the Great Recession and stuff, there was more attention to credit unions being alternative to commercial banks, and so there was that growth. And then people are saying, okay, so if the system really isn't working for us, what are the alternative types? And so then people seem to be really excited to hear about what these alternative types are and what kinds of things they could do. So especially food co-ops in black communities, and immigrant communities, worker co-ops, especially in immigrant communities, but also some black communities, and among youth, they've started to take off. And so people now seem really hungry to find out sort of what are all the possible structures and forms that they could take, can they do it legally, what can they do informally, and so there seems to be more and more interest.
And how does that sort of interface with the big politics and sort of
well,
Trump and anti-Trump and socialism?
Does it pretty much under the radar in some ways. People, I think, have felt like they just need to do what they can control, and especially since we don't feel like we have a lot of control over the national politics and even some of the statewide politics. The people I talk to now are much more interested in municipal politics. Right. And what they can do in their block and their neighborhood municipally, right? So there's actually a strong movement now, especially in the worker co-op movement in New York City. There's about 10 or 12 cities that are actually promoting and putting some money toward worker co-op development, education, and loan funds.
Right.
New York City, Atlanta, Richmond, Virginia, Richmond, California, I think Buffalo. Anyway, there's about 10 or 12 cities. So it's interesting. There's a real municipal level of Madison, Wisconsin, of excitement about using public money, municipal level public money, to do co-op education and worker co-op development. Right. And so that's sort of where the big push is happening right now. Some of it is very small worker co-ops, but there's some projects that are bigger. And then some things are starting small and then trying to grow bigger.
So, and you were saying, if I heard right, there's sort of a link to the feeling that the bigger system's not working.
Right.
That the bigger structures are falling to bits. And I suppose, I wonder whether, as that quite likely accentuates, with climate change and maybe breaking down of social structures and so on, that maybe the push, the drive for more local forms of collaboration may increase.
I think so, because we're also seeing, I'm part of a group called Green Worker Cooperatives. There's other groups too that are combining green jobs and sustainability with worker ownership or community ownership, and so that connection to we can also better control what we're doing to the environment and better control all levels of sustainability through cooperatives, worker ownership, that kind of thing. So I think that's notion, and that connection is growing also. And the fact that you can, there are good examples of co-ops that are sort of zero carbon footprint, and co-ops that are doing actual recycling, doing organic farming, that kind of thing. So there's a notion that you can do both, right? That it's easier with a co-op to take care of that kind of thing as well as take care of people. You can also take care of the planet. That seems to be a growing notion. And more people are sort of interested in that combination, I think.
And in terms of your research and looking at these different types of co-ops in different places, are there any sort of things you notice in terms of where they succeed, the circumstances more likely for success, or what drives success?
Yeah, the interesting thing about success, from when I started this research, people kept asking me, okay, so what are the best industries to go into, or who are the best people to do this with, right? And it turned out neither of those are the right question to ask. The right question is really about what are the best resources, what's the set of resources that people need to make this work. So it's not that it's better if you do it in domestic service or as opposed to a factory or something. It's really about, you need to make sure people know how to work together, right? How to make decisions together, how to address conflict, how to build trust, and that you need people to be comfortable with learning by doing and learning together. That seems, for me, those are the lessons more than whether the milk industry or the tire industry or whatever. So it's not, I found strong co-ops in almost any sector, whether it's sex workers or credit unions or a window factory. That doesn't seem to matter. It's really about what kind of pre-education, what kind of education and training, what kind of capacity building you do, and to make sure we do the kind of capacity building. Because the other problem in the U.S. especially is that we're not taught to cooperate. In fact, I go on a rampage about our kindergartens where we teach kids not to cooperate. We pretend that we teach them to cooperate, but we really teach them to be little capitalists, right?
We don't say share nicely.
Right, we say play nicely, right? But then if they want to share an idea, right, that's cheating, right? You're not supposed to collaborate with your neighbor about an idea or an answer to a question, right? You're supposed to either come up with it by yourself or regurgitate what the teacher already told you. Well, none of that lends itself to cooperation and cooperative economics, right? So by the time they get to first grade and second grade, they're learning how to just be in their little individual box and
beat the others.
And right, there's some great story about a little kid who got up in the middle of some standardized test to go over to ask another student the question, and of course, right, everybody was upset and they were about to kick him out of the test and whatever, and they asked him, why would you do that? You're supposed to sit there and answer these questions by yourself. And he said, well, if John knows the answer, then we all know the answer. He said, so I was just checking with John to see what John knew, which of course is what we would want in the world if we were really cooperating, right? But in our current world, that was the worst possible thing that poor child could do, when in the real world it actually made the most sense, right? So in some ways we have to relearn, right?
Who is doing this re-education or building, or
So there's some of us who are trying to figure out ways to teach cooperation in schools, change the way we teach in schools, because actually a lot of the newest pedagogy is back to that students who cooperate learn better, or who teach each other and learn, right? So we need to strengthen that pedagogy and do it more. We need to do it outside of the classroom, right? So supplementary activities I've seen a lot of interesting youth co-op development after school or in a nonprofit on Saturdays or summer programs, and that's turning out to be really interesting, getting young people to start their own co-ops. But while they're doing that, you're teaching them all this stuff that they need to relearn, how to work together, how to make decisions together. And as little entrepreneurs and business people, they also have to learn their math. They have to know how to read and communicate better, so they're doing better in school. When they, so there's lots of ways that we can think about that kind of training, either outside of school or if we can get a hold of the school systems. I know Puerto Rico actually has a K through 12 co-op education program, and they do contests and things about cooperation, and so they actually see a reason to teach their kids about cooperation and cooperatives.
But presumably you mainly come into communities with more mature people, and you have they need to get the sort of capacities.
Right.
Or
so you've got it. So now the strongest worker co-ops that I found are the ones that have these very strong training and orientation programs.
And who provides those?
Well, the best ones, the co-op themselves. So if it's an already existing co-op, they set aside a certain amount of money to continue to do that to all their new members. Some of the strongest co-op development groups that I've seen are worker co-ops themselves, who have then become co-op developers, and they use money from an existing co-op. There's a model, the Arizmendi Bakeries in Oakland, California. Their model is they took a very successful worker co-op pizzeria, I guess it's a bakery pizzeria. They then got that co-op to agree to put 25% of their profits every year into co-op development, and they started this Arizmendi Bakeries program. They have a whole program to train, right? They do it shop by shop. They train the people to run their own second bakery. So instead of a whole franchise model, it's just developing a new, right? But the co-op group is the one that does all the training and development, works with them. When that store becomes successful, that store also puts in 25% of its profits. They use that money to go start another store. They're now getting into housing too, because the worker owners now said they don't just need jobs, they need better housing, so they're doing co-op housing, the group. But anyway, their notion is you work from a successful existing co-op and use some of that success to put in money to help train. And then they actually pay people to be trained. So the old model for co-ops was that you volunteer to kind of get the co-op started, you put in your sweat equity. But this model, you use existing co-op money to pay people for the training so they get trained properly.
But you have to be lucky enough to have a successful co-op.
Yeah. If you don't, you still go back to the sweat equity model. But the sweat equity model, people have to be aware that they need to put this time and effort to make it stronger. I mean, that's one of the lessons I learned from all the research I did, that the groups that did study groups, learning together, deliberate orientation and training were the ones that lasted longer, that were stronger. That were able to either reproduce themselves or stay on, sustain themselves, that kind of thing. And then the other piece was the groups that had the most connection to their communities. So the groups whose community understood why they were a co-op, what they were doing, lasted longer also, because then if there was an assault on them or if there was problems within the group, the fact that the community wanted them to succeed and either patronized them or supported them or knew what they were doing or stopped the city from attacking them, that kind of stuff, they lasted longer. So the internal education, collective learning, and then community support seemed to be the most important thing. So it didn't really matter what kind of industry, even whether you did capital intensive or labor intensive, but obviously labor intensive if you don't have any money. But really what mattered was these other kinds of connections and resources.
And what about the wider outcomes? Because obviously you got into this about the wider sort of benefits, the justice and these wider things, way beyond just the economic success.
Right.
So have these turned out to be what you expected them to be?
Yes, but we're slow about the measuring what I'm calling impacts and benefits of cooperatives. I started to work with a group in Canada. There's a few people in the U.S. who are doing it. We still don't have great data, but the data we do have looks really good in terms of we can show the traditional economic benefits, usually higher paying jobs, better job mobility, creating economic activity where there was a void or a gap. So like rural electric co-ops, right? There's no rural electricity because the capitalists can't make money electrifying people so far away, but the rural electrics are actually one of the most wealthy of the co-op sectors. So they showed that having rural electricity doesn't have to be a drain on an economy if it's not capitalist, if it's a co-op economy, right?
Yeah.
So we're showing that we can get traditional economic gains, right? Better productivity, labor productivity is higher in co-ops, those kind of things. So we have that down. Some of us have begun to talk about the social and human capital gains from co-ops. So the human capital, as I said, co-ops are a learning institution. So you learn by doing, you learn, right? So people gain human capital. They gain training, knowledge that's transferable to other things.
Yeah.
So we see that it's harder to measure that, but we have some stuff is coming out about that. And also even people when if the co-op fails or goes under or whatever, all those human capital and social capital, they use it to do other things. They might start another co-op, they might be more civically involved, whatever. So we have some data about that as well. We have data on civic participation. More people who are involved in co-ops tend to get involved in other civic activities. They bring that participation and transparency to other civic things. So we see some of that. It's not a total, what do you call it? It's not a seamless movement, but we're trying to figure out ways to measure that better, but we do. And then leadership development is one of the areas. Actually, an interview I did with the head of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives about 20 years ago, he mentioned that they noticed the leadership development from their staff and from co-op members. They saw that once you got involved with the co-op, you ended up taking on leadership both in the co-op and out in the world. And some of their members even went and ran for public office and things like that.
Wow.
Some of the worker co-ops have actually done deliberate training on non-traditional leadership development. So you don't have to be a hierarchical leader, but all the different ways. What does leadership look like in all the different ways? We see leadership development in the youth co-ops, in the women-run co-ops, where women suddenly, after being in their own co-op, take leadership in the PTA and other things, take more leadership at home, that kind of thing. So we can start to document all these other different pieces that then strengthen the community that's around them and often help create more co-ops. So you end up getting infrastructure of co-ops within your community, which leads to that community wealth that I started out talking about.
Brilliant. Well, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Jessica, to cover such a wide range of stuff over such a short period. But I think that's really great, and thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much.